Hey everybody, Pastor Dusty here. I got your next Shape Up recap. And so we're still talking about the ideal Christian family. And this week we're going to talk more specifically about the Christian marriage. And I do believe that this is one area that we need to do a lot of work in. Uh, Statistics say 1 in 2 marriages fail. 50% of all marriages end in divorce. The leading cause of that is infidelity. And it's so sad. The second leading cause is money. People fight over money all the time. But it's so sad that 1 out of 2 marriages end in divorce, and within 2 years usually is what the study I was reading showed. And so the Christian church is not exempt of this. Now, this is something that is affecting Christian families, and for the last several decades, I don't believe that we have understood marriage correctly, because I've seen it went from a bad thing to worse, to where it used to be marriage was viewed, there was a dominating authoritarian presence, which was the male, and women were viewed as a subspecies to them, and that's not God's design, by the way. God didn't create marriage to be like that. Man created marriage like that. But now we live in a culture where divorce is we have a consumer mentality. And so people try something and then they decide they don't like it and they throw it away. And so people have adopted that into a marriage. And in Christian churches, this is happening too. And so the other thing is people are trying to redefine marriage because, well, they want to be their own gods. And it's the same thing that happened in Genesis when the snake came to Eve and tempted her to eat the forbidden fruit. He says, you can be like God. Basically what he was saying is you get to be your own God and make the rules, and you'll be smart like God. And so we have this now because in this current culture, they have a marriage. They say a man and a man can be married, and a woman can be married. And that's not a godly marriage, and God will never bless that marriage. And as a matter of fact, that's not even a marriage. The Bible defines marriage as one man and one woman, one biological man and one biological woman. That is what marriage consists of: 2 people who make a divine covenant with one another before God and before people. And God will bless that marriage and only that marriage. Anything outside of that is sin. So I don't care what anyone else says. I believe what the Bible says. The Bible is true, and every man a liar. And so this is the biblical marriage. And so we have these problems now, and our kids are growing up in a culture where they're questioning, what does a real marriage look like? And so I felt it was necessary to include this in the Shape Up series. A Christian marriage is meant to illuminate the glorious news of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And everybody agrees that a good marriage is pleasant and beneficial. And we understand that whenever there is any kind of confusion in the home and there's any kind of division in the home, the whole house is affected by it. And so we understand that when God created this, you need to get this. He meant for it to be in unity. He didn't mean for one person to lord over the other. He didn't mean for the confusion. What does the Bible say? Any kingdom divided against itself is going to fall. And that kingdom is your home too. And so in your home, if the husband and wife are constantly at one another and they're not giving grace to one another, it's going to fail, because the Bible says that any kingdom divided against itself will not stand. And so who's affected? Our kids are affected. Generations after are affected. And so this is an area we need to shape up in. When husbands and wives truly understand the responsibilities that God has given them individually in the marriage, it is going to maximize their potential to fulfill their divine purpose. And so we need to understand, each person in the marriage has this divine purpose, and each has strengths and gifts, and they're not always the same. In my home, Bridget and I did a spiritual gift test a couple months ago, and it was interesting to me. My top 3 gifts were not her top 3 gifts, and actually my weakest gifts were her strongest, and it was the same thing with me. We complemented one another, and so a Christian marriage, it has to be built on unity, and it has to have Christ in the middle of it. And if God's not in the middle of your marriage, if you don't center your marriage around God, it is going to be terrible. If you want your marriage to be successful and you want it to be what God designed it, include Him. If you want it to be terrible, then keep Him out of it. I mean, it's as simple as that. But Dr. Tony Evans has a quote. It says, for far too many people, the subject of marriage is a three-ring circus. It says, first there's the engagement ring, next comes the wedding ring, and then there's the suffering. And that's kind of funny, but at the same time, it's true, because a lot of people are suffering in their marriages, and I think people are stuck tolerating one another, but that's not how God views us. Romans 15:7, it says, therefore accept each other just as Christ has accepted you, so that God will be given glory. And so you apply this to your home and to your marriage. Accept your spouse the same way that God accepts you. God doesn't tolerate you. He embraces you. So you need to be embracing of your spouse, considerate and loving and caring and concerned with their well-being above your own. And if they're doing the same thing to honor God and you're doing it to honor God, you're going to have perfect unity. And the Bible says, where there's unity, God has commanded His blessing. And so we can have this in our homes, and so we need to do this. And I feel like so many people are living in a marriage where they just simply tolerate one another. They don't understand. Marriage is work. Marriage is a garden. When you work, when the garden gets planted, there's breaking of the soil. You got to go through and pick out the rocks. You got to clean the weeds out. And then you plant the garden, and then the work isn't stopped. There's a continual process. You got to prune the plants. You got to stake up the plants. You got to water them. You got to provide fertilizer for them, and it's a process, and it takes a lot of work. And if you neglect your garden, 2 weeks down the road, it's going to be overtaken by weeds. And so you have to be constantly, and that's a marriage. That's exactly how a marriage is. It is a constant work on both parts. And so we have to understand this in order to understand a godly marriage, and so we have to be considerate of those who are weaker than we are, and everybody has gifts and talents, and everybody has strengths and weaknesses, and so we got to be considerate of our spouse's weaknesses, and so this often doesn't happen very much because we often focus only on the weakness, but we never focus on their strength. We need to be focusing on their strength, and so in your marriage, I'm asking you a question. Are you focused only on pleasing yourself? Or are you focused on lifting up your partner in prayer and helping them to become the best version of themselves that they can possibly be? And if you are doing the second part, if you're constantly trying to help them become the best person, the best version of themselves, and they're doing that for you, you have what God designed for a marriage, and you will flourish in that marriage. You will certainly flourish. But God did not design a marriage to be a one-sided domination. And for so long, it's been viewed one way or the other. For decades ago, the man was the dominating person in the marriage, and the woman stayed in the kitchen and cooked the food and folded the clothes and did the laundry. And I believe this is what created this feminist movement, which is not of God either, where now the women want to be the ones ruling the house and the men need to be submissive. And our culture has even flipped it. The males are portrayed on TV shows as stupid, as a bunch of buffoons, and the women are the responsible, smart ones. And that's not godly either. This is meant to be a holy matrimony, and the male is not to be dominating over the female, and the female is not to be dominating over the male. In the home, God has given the spiritual authority to the male. That is what the Bible says. He is the one who is the spiritual priest of the home. The wife is not of less value. She has an equal value, just different roles. And so as we go, I'm going to talk more about that in the next video. But for this video, what I want to talk about is centering your marriage around Christ and submitting to one another. Because in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 21, this verse is hardly ever included in the breakdown of what Paul is talking about how the marriage should be. But most people don't include this, and I believe it was intended to be included because it just fits. It makes sense. Ephesians 5:21, it says, and further submit to one another out of reverence to Christ. And so right away when we talk about submission in a marriage, it's always the woman submits. But before Paul says that, He says that we should submit to one another out of our reverence for Christ, out of our respect for Jesus. And so that means, yes, the wife submits to her husband, but also the husband can submit to his wife. We have a very distorted view of what submission is. Most people think submission is slavery, but it isn't. It's willfully surrendering your will to another person. When I come to Jesus, I submitted to his leadership. I willfully chose to come under the leadership of Christ. And so what does this look like, in a marriage home? And I think if everybody would understand this would help a lot of problems in marriages. So Paul's presenting this idea of submission, and he says that we are to be in submission to one another out of our fear for God, out of our reverence for God. And so how do we honor God? By being obedient to his commandments. And so we can willfully submit to one another in a home, and this is not being totally passive. This doesn't mean you have to become a doormat for your spouse. This isn't where one spouse dominates the other, but we submit in the areas that we are weakest in. And so Bridget and I did a spiritual gift survey, and her strongest gifts are my weakest. And my strongest gifts are her weakest gifts. And so it's so cool because we complement one another. And for an example, Bridget is strong in the gift of administration. She's good in ruling. She's good at getting things done, planning things. The checkbook works so much better when Bridget has it. I'm a procrastinator. I don't do a good checkbook. And so what do? I yield and submit to her strength, and I let her handle that area. But on the other hand, my strongest gift is shepherding. And of course, I'm a pastor, so that would make sense. But in that area, lead and feed. That's my main thing. Spiritually care and tend. And so when it comes to the spiritual needs of a home, she submits to me. She yields to me. What is God's design? Ultimately, big decisions come to the husband. A spiritual-led husband makes big decisions, but he doesn't do it without his wife's input, and she shouldn't try to do things without his input. They do it together in unity. They talk about it, and they make a decision together. When God made Adam, he created him out of the dust of the ground, and he breathed life into him, and then he took the rib bone from Adam to make Eve, because he said it wasn't good for man to be alone. He didn't take a bone out of Adam's head so that the woman would lord over him. He didn't take a bone out of the feet so that he could stand over her. He took it out of the side. Why did he do that? Here's why I think. Because they're equal. They share in the same position, and she would be then under his arm, protected by him and cared for by him. I believe that's why God did that. So you yield to your weaknesses if your spouse has a strength there, and then she or whoever it is would yield back where her weaknesses are. And that's how you maintain unity in a home. And so practical tips for this: focus on your spouse's strengths instead of their weaknesses. Encourage them instead of criticizing them. Pray for your spouse instead of gossiping about them. Don't go to work and tell the guys how bad your wife is, and vice versa. Wives, don't go tell everyone in town how terrible your husband is. If you have a complaint, take it up with God. Don't take it up with anybody else. But for the sake of making your marriage work, focus on their strengths and encourage them instead of criticizing them. Learn what Christ teaches about relating to and loving others. And so I wanted to emphasize this because we're going to start talking about the duties of a husband and the duties of a wife, in a marriage. And I think we're going to find that what we've understood for a long time has been incorrect. And what God has designed, if we do it, we're going to have a wonderful, flourishing marriage that is fulfilling, and we will together be able to fulfill our divine purpose. I hope that this helped you today. Thanks for tuning in. God bless you.